Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever. Today we're going to continue looking at the origins of Franciscan spirituality. We'll look at the last two great spiritual doctors from the first millennium who helped prepare the path that led to our Franciscan heritage. The two spiritual giants are St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Benedict of Nursia. We'll still borrow most of this from Pope Benedict's 2007, 2008 Wednesday audiences in outlining some of the important aspects of their lives and their spirituality. St. Augustine was baptized by St. Ambrose. He truly gave new and profound insights into Western spirituality, really a spiritual richness which perhaps after St. Paul the Church hasn't seen since St. Augustine. Augustine's uniqueness in Christian history really is a quite amazing thing. He's called the greatest father of the Latin Church. He's also the father of the Church who's left us the greatest number of written works too. Pope Paul VI stressed the importance of Augustine, saying that, quote, all the thought currents of the past meet in his works and form the source which provides the whole doctrinal tradition of succeeding ages, unquote. It's actually quite an unbelievable compliment when you think about that. The crucial theme of St. Augustine's biography, his Confessions, is the encounter of faith and reason and the encounter of the creature and his Creator, his Redeemer. A passionate lover of truth, Augustine wrote after his conversion that faith and reason are the two forces that lead us to knowledge. And his two famous sayings, his two famous maxims in this regard are crede ut intelligas, meaning I believe in order to understand. So that means that belief actually paves the way to embracing the fullness of truth, greater understanding. And also, two, intellige ut credas, I understand the better to believe. So what he's saying is that belief and understanding reinforce each other, basically. The more we grow in our understanding of God and of the truth, which he's the author of course, the more our understanding grows, the deeper our faith and our trust in God will grow as well. In his Confessions, Augustine described man as a great enigma, magna quaestio, and a great abyss, grande profundum. An enigma and an abyss that only Christ can illuminate and save us from. He taught that a man who's distant from God is also distant from himself, alienated from himself, and can only find himself by encountering God. So in finding God, we return to ourselves. We actually return to our true self. We actually embrace our true identity. It reminded me of the Hebrew word for conversion. In Hebrew, it's shimvad-bet. It means actually turn or return. So turn to God, and you return not only to Him, but you return to yourself as well. Augustine wrote, it seems to me that the hope of finding the truth must be restored to humankind. He wrote that in the 5th century. Could have wrote those same words today, actually, since the world we live in has really destroyed and mutilated the truth and abandoned the truth in so many ways. The hope of finding the truth is basically the hope of finding Jesus Christ. Christ is the way, the only way for St. Augustine. Outside this way, he says, quote, which has never been lacking for the human race. Outside of this way, quote, no one has been set free and no one will be set free, says St. Augustine. And Pope Benedict, in one of those general audiences, he actually gave 5 Wednesday audiences just on St. Augustine. Pope Benedict spoke of Augustine's 3 conversions, which we'll mention. The first was Augustine's embracing of the Christian faith which he had been instructed in as a child by his mother, which he had abandoned once he left home. His search for the truth after that brought him to discover the beauties of ancient philosophy, and ultimately it did bring him back to Christ. Pope Benedict writes this. He said, "Only by reading St. Paul's epistles within the faith of the Catholic Church was the truth fully revealed to him." This experience was summarized by Augustine in one of the most famous passages of the Confessions. He recounts that in the torment of his reflections, withdrawing to a garden, he suddenly heard a child's voice chanting a rhythm never heard before. Tolle legge, which means pick up and read, pick up and read. He then remembered the conversion of St. Anthony, father of monasticism, and he carefully returned to the Pauline Codex that he had recently read. He opened it, and his glance fell on the passage of the Epistle to the Romans where the apostle exhorts us to abandon the works of the flesh and be clothed with Christ. That's the first thing he saw when he opened that book, Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. The Pope continues, he says, Augustine understood that those words in that moment were addressed personally to him. They came from God through the apostle and indicated to him what he had to do at that time. Thus he felt the darkness of doubt clearing, and he finally found himself free to give himself entirely to Christ. So that was St. Augustine's first conversion, which did lead to his baptism. His second conversion came when he realized that he was called to live for others. After his baptism at the hands of St. Ambrose, Augustine returned to his native Africa and founded a small monastery there where he retreated with a few friends to dedicate himself to contemplation and to study, which really was his life's dream, being able to contemplate and study. Benedict XVI writes this, he says, now he was called to live totally for the truth, with the truth, in friendship with Christ, who is the truth. A beautiful dream that lasted 3 years, until he was, against his will, ordained a priest at Hippo and destined to serve the faithful. Continuing, yes, to live with Christ and for Christ, but at the service of all. This was very difficult for Augustine, but he understood from the beginning that only by living for others and not simply for his private contemplation could he really live with Christ and for Christ. And he understood that one reaches others with simplicity and humility, and that was his true second conversion, says the Holy Father. So Augustine wasn't destined by God, as some people are, to live a hidden life of contemplation. He was destined to be a great shepherd and a great teacher, a destiny that he did say yes to. In a beautiful passage, Augustine defines prayer as the expression of desire, and he affirms that God responds to that desire by moving our hearts towards him. On our part, we have to, of course, purify our desires and our hopes to welcome the sweetness of God. And it's only in the opening of ourselves to others that saves us. This first other being God, the second other being our neighbor. Lastly, Augustine's third conversion was when he began to understand that every day he needed to ask forgiveness for his sins. Repentance and conversion aren't just one-time affairs. He realized that this need for a permanent and continual conversion, and that was something that he actually carried with him to his deathbed too. Regarding his spirituality, Augustine's dialectical way of reasoning helped him give him a penetrating analysis of the mysteries of faith, and he added to that great intelligence and ardent heart which was full of love for God. He saw Christianity as true life, as life rooted in Christ, a life which he sought with uncontested passion. His spirituality is centered on love, a love which is centered on and leads to and really flows from God as well. Even the ascetical life, the life of renunciation, for Augustine, that's just an activity of love which continually spurs us to deny ourselves. Even asceticism is just a form of love for him. So So St. Augustine gets St. John's spirituality. He really understands it, as well as St. Paul's too. He grasps the mystical and the unitive motive of spirituality because it fits his temperament. But he actually doesn't fully develop these aspects. His mysticism remains more of an isolated and a personal fact, which for a while didn't gain much traction in Christian spirituality until much later on. The last great doctor we'll mention today is Saint Benedict, born in Norcia in 50 years after Augustine's death. Benedict is the founder of Western monasticism. Essentially, his rule, the rule of Saint Benedict, is really responsible for changing the face of Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire. His rule inspired a religious and a cultural unity that spiritually united the various peoples of Europe under the one Christian faith. When Benedict was of age, his financially well-off parents actually sent him to study in Rome. Didn't stay there very long. St. Gregory, his biographer, says that he was put off by the sinful lifestyles of many students there and didn't want to follow their example. His aim in life, even at that early time, was only to please God. Benedict left Rome and spent some time in the mountains outside of the city. He made a short stay in a religious community of monks. Then he became a hermit in nearby Subiaco. He lived there in a cave alone for 3 years, actually. It was there, says Pope Benedict, that Saint Benedict bore and overcame the 3 fundamental temptations of every human being: the temptation to self-affirmation, the desire to put oneself at the center of everything, the temptation to sensuality, and lastly, the temptation of anger and revenge. In fact, Benedict was convinced that only after overcoming these temptations would he be able to say a useful word to others about their situation of neediness. Thus, having tranquilized his soul, he could be in full control of the drive of his ego and thus create peace around him. Only then did he decide to found the monasteries, writes Pope Benedict. It's a good lesson there for all of us in a sense. It's best to be first at peace in your own heart before you think you can establish peace with other people or among other people. You can't really give what you don't have, as the saying goes. So you better be a person of peace before you want to help others to reach that too. St. Benedict's life was steeped in an atmosphere of prayer. Prayer was the foundation of his existence. Without prayer, there's no experience of God, said the Holy Father in his general audience on Benedict. But prayer is also meant to lead to service too, as Augustine learned as well. In his rule, Benedict describes monastic life as a school for the service of the Lord. He said that in the first place, prayer is an act of listening, which must then be expressed in action. So the monk's life should be a fruitful marriage of action and contemplation so that God may be glorified in all things, which is what the rule states. Benedict embraced the Eastern spirit of asceticism, drawing from the rules of life of St. Pachomius, St. Basil, even St. Augustine, St. John Cassian, but he adopted their asceticism to the Western world. He took the ancient Roman concept of the family, the importance of the family, and he conceived monastic life in that way, as family life lived under the obedience of an abbot. For Benedict, the abbot must be both a tender father and a strict teacher, a true educator, inflexible against vices, but above all, called to imitate the tenderness of the Good Shepherd, quote, to serve rather than to rule, in order to, quote, show the monks what is good and holy by means of his deeds more than by his words, and illustrate the divine precepts by his example. Again, that's what is written in the rule of Saint Benedict. So monasticism takes its cue from Benedict, and its cornerstones are prayer, marked by the canonical hours of each day, and work done in obedience and in humility. The monastery then becomes a school of perfection, and the individual monk searches for God and for union with Him through the celebration of the divine office and the liturgy, which is the work of God, the highest one. The monk also embraces the imitation of Christ, whose faith tells us is the foundation of the ascetical life and the all-sufficient source of grace. And it's in this identifying the ascetical climb as a work of grace that St. Benedict really brings to Christian spirituality. It's really a gift that he brings, and he helps distinguish it from his predecessors, what they brought, understanding the ascetical life as a work of grace. That being said, Benedictine spirituality in its beginning was primarily ascetical and theocentric. The monk was called to adore God, who dwells in inaccessible light, as we read in 1 Timothy 4:16. And Christ is seen as the model to imitate, the guide we must follow, the uncreated light which enlightens every man. But the intimacy that unites the faithful soul to Christ, the God-man, still isn't really grasped. The sense of intimacy with Christ isn't quite there with St. Benedict and the rule. I hope some of that makes sense. I know it's a lot to take in at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's probably close to 7:30 by now. But let's ask Our Lady for the grace to understand what she wants us to understand better in these reflections, so that, as St. Augustine might say, we can believe more firmly and more faithfully in her divine Son. Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever.